Hi, I'm John Berry, editor, book designer, typographer. I've designed books since the beginning of the digital age, and we have a bit to show you about that. Jason?
I'm Jason Palmental. I'm web typographer and web designer and tinkerer with lots of digital things. And John and I have been collaborating for several years on where we think the journey of the book might go next. So John's going to give you a little bit of history, and then I'll give you a little bit of a demonstration and show you what we've been working on. Back to you, John.
Okay, let's go. We all know what a book is. You can hold it in your hand and you can read it. You can refer to it. You can store it on a shelf, and you can give it to someone else. It's a compendium of information, whether that information is literature, philosophy, poetry, art, photography, a dictionary, or a how-to manual. Since the invention of the printing press, books have been mass-produced. Before that, they were all written by hand, each copy unique. In ancient Greece and Rome, the common form of a book was a scroll, which you would hold in two hands and unroll, unroll page by page. The codex form that we're familiar with, of individual pages bound together along one edge, gradually took over from the scroll form, and by the early Middle Ages was practically universal. The design of a book takes into account its form. In a scroll, each page is independent, and to read it, you would show one page at a time. In a bound book, each page faces another page in what we know as the two-page spread. How that book opens depends on how it is bound. In the 20th century, the German typographer Jan Schickhold published studies of how medieval copyists arranged their text on the page, with due care for proportion and convenience, as well as art. One of the principles used was the golden section and variations on it. Schickhold used these principles to produce elegantly readable books in traditional style in the 20th century. Schickhold was also a seminal modernist, especially in his youth, and he pioneered a radically different approach, asymmetrical page layout. Both techniques paid close attention to every element and how it's positioned, not only on the page, but on the two-page spread of facing pages. Today, we use both techniques interchangeably, but in the middle of the 20th century, there were aesthetic wars fought between symmetrical and asymmetrical design. But one element that keeps getting forgotten is that the page spread is not a flat surface. It's three-dimensional. It's two flat, flexible surfaces bound together down the middle. In the old days, book bindings were all sewn by hand. There was no other way to do it. That meant that the book, when open, would lie almost flat. Modern binding practices more often involve glue, or a combination of sewn and glued, and the result is that the pages do not lie flat. There is always a gutter between the pages, and with some binding methods, like the misleadingly named perfect binding, which is entirely glued, that gutter can become a shadowy canyon that hides the inner edges of the paper. So we've evolved techniques for designing pages and page spreads that take into account how the book will be bound. In a traditional symmetrical book design, the inner margins would be narrower than the outer margins, so that the two text blocks don't feel isolated from each other. For a perfect bound modern book, however, I have often found that in order to get that pleasant effect, you have to make the inner margins wider, sometimes even wider than the outer margins. If you're designing a book that will be sent to a contemporary print-on-demand printer, you can take that requirement as a given, no matter how flexible their bindings may be. The essential thing to remember is that the page spread is an artifact of the codex form. We're used to it, but it's not a given. Now, I've been talking about books that are essentially made up of a long-running text, but from the earliest days of bookmaking, people have been creating books that combine text and images. How they fit together is a matter of page layout, and in a visually complex book, it's definitely a matter of the design of the page spreads. Just think of how all the elements fit together on the pages of an art book, or a cookbook, or a computer software manual, or a scientific textbook. And you can see that there's more to book design than just placing a running text. The typography of books has changed along with the technology. not only printing technology, but typesetting technology. We're no longer setting type by hand, one letter at a time, at least not unless we're deliberately practicing an antique craft. When phototypesetting took over from hot metal machine setting, wanted to use the same typefaces they were used to, but in photographic form. But a direct adaptation of the design of a metal typeface to photo typesetting and offset printing ended up looking light and spindly, not the same effect at all. New typefaces had to be designed for the new medium. The same thing happened when digital typesetting replaced photo typesetting. The most effective typefaces were newly designed for the digital medium, even if they might be quite classical in form. The ultimate goal is still the same, a page of black text, clearly typeset and easy to read. How you get there, however, keeps changing. Today, the pages we're looking at may no longer be paper, but virtual, not a static surface, but dynamic and changeable. All sorts of attempts have been made to turn printed books into digital books, but most of them are unsatisfactory. eBooks are mostly workable but clunky, with only primitive controls over typography and responsive layout. And now we have a new technological wrinkle, which we're still figuring out how to use: variable fonts, which are also dynamic and changeable. And this leads me neatly into Jason's half of our presentation.
Thanks, John. Okay, so we want to look at what the future of the book might be. And I think we can all agree that phones and digital devices are not going to go away, and there will be ever increasing demands for being able to read something comfortably on a digital device. And I agree with John that I don't think that the current technology implementations for ebooks of any sort are really doing the best job of bringing forward the important elements of typographic detail that really make for a great reading experience. And you still have this various kinds of format lock-in that you could only read it on this device or only share it there. And that is also its own kind of issue. So looking at this 1932 edition of Moby Dick as a guide, I've tried to spend a little time with John looking at what makes something bookish. What are these characteristics? And those things revolve around legibility, readability, the refinements that we want to bring to it, and the personal aspect of it, something that you can hold and dog ear and love and read and reread and in other cases share. So we wanted to make sure that we can encompass all of those things digitally, and then also take it further, really embrace the medium and make sure that we can make this experience even more personal, even more shareable, even more portable than it has currently been possible. So let's dig into some of these characteristics. So legibility. It needs to be legible. And to do that, we want to look at well-made typefaces that are optimized for use on the screen. And even though they may have a classical form, they're probably still optimized better for viewing, particularly on today's high-resolution screens. So being able to go back to a more familiar style of typeface for longer form reading, I think, is a really nice thing to be able to do, to get into the details of nicely designed and crafted serif typeface. That's something that with the increased quality in the screens, we can still go back to that nicer form that will blend the letter forms a little bit better for us as we go. Now, that also brings with us the ability to not just set the size and choose the typeface, but with variable fonts, bringing with it some ideas about typeface design and creation that are hundreds of years old. So the idea of having an optical size axis, one where we can have this sort of sturdier design that works well at small sizes, but then when it's set at a larger size can actually still bring in those finer details. That's really wonderful to be able to do all of this with a single asset. And variable fonts do have a lot of other characteristics and possibilities. We're going to talk particularly about optical size, which we see here in the larger headings, appropriate with that fine detail and stronger contrast versus the sturdier letter forms at the smaller size that hold up well. But we also want to look at some of the other things that we can do, and we're going to look at that some of the other aspects of variable fonts as we go forward. Now, we also want it to not just be legible, but also be readable. So things like line length. We want to make sure that we're typesetting our paragraphs and body copy well so that it creates a comfortable reading experience. So type size and line length, but we also want to make sure we don't forget about line height or leading. We want to make sure that as the line lengths get longer, and it can be proportional to the size of the text, so can the line height. So as the line lengths get longer, we space the lines out a little bit more, just as we would in print. And we also need to make sure that we can have some sort of pacing indicator. So when we have multiple paragraphs, what has typically been the practice on the web is to space those paragraphs apart, but that can really have a negative impact for longer form reading on breaking up the pacing of your reading. And that's why it's nice to be able to go with an indent to indicate the break into a new paragraph when you're trying to optimize for that longer form reading experience. We also want to bring in some refinements. So you'll notice now the first line of this that first paragraph is bold. This is also taking advantage of the fact that this is a variable font that contains a weight axis in addition to the optical size. So we don't have to load a separate file, and we don't have to automatically opt for a 700 weight. We might be able to make the decision to use something in the middle. So maybe the body copy itself is set around 350 or 375. Maybe it's 400. Maybe we don't want to jump all the way to 700 for bold for that first line. Maybe it's only 600 or 650. So we don't have to load multiple assets. We can reach into that that typeface and this particular single font file and have full access to the range of optical size and weight that the typeface designer has exposed to us. We can also add things like initial capitals. So what we're looking at here is the ability to use a single font file that gives us the weight axis, allows us to style the first line, set an initial capital. These are all typographic refinements that may or may not suit your style, but it's nice to know that we can do these things. Now, the other thing that we need to keep in mind as we're optimizing our typography is we need to remember we don't know what size the page is going to be. So our typography has to be relative to itself and responsive. So even when we see these things change and go from a large screen to a small, we've adapted the size of the text, we've adapted the line height and the line length to make sure that it works well on the device upon which it's being viewed. And that's really important for us to remember that we don't have control over some of these things. So we want to exert control where we can, but also design in a flexible way that takes into account we don't know what size the device is, where they're going to be reading it, or even whether it's day or night. So this is another feature that's become really popular on mobile devices and increasingly on desktops is the use of dark mode. A lot of people find this easier on the eyes. It can help conserve battery. There's a whole bunch of different reasons why people might want to adapt to that. So we want not only can the phone operating system or the desktop operating system react to that, our web page can react to it too. But we want to make sure that in the course of adapting to this reverse contrast, using the variable font that we have at our disposal, we can subtly reduce the weight of the text. So when it's light text on a dark background, the letters don't bleed together quite as much. So we can nudge that font weight down just 25 or 30 instead of jumping to a full separate weight file as a separate instance used to dictate we would need to do. So we can now start to go beyond what is easily manageable on another ebook format, but also react to things in a way that we weren't able to do in paper. So coming back to this style, we now can start to think about how can we take this personalization further. So in making it personal, we want to ensure that we can do a little bit more. So not just the light mode, but also some of the qualities of the typography itself. So again, this comes back to my comment earlier about needing to be flexible and relative to itself. So when things change on this device, you'll notice that the line height and the text size all shifted when this device size got smaller, but we're also able to expose some settings. So not only can they switch the light mode, but they can also customize the font size, the line spacing, and even the word spacing. So anything that will help that reader use this a little bit better and make it a little bit more of a personalized experience that will help them be more comfortable reading it, those are things that we can and should start to think about in the design of our digital reading experience. We also might decide that we'd like to experience it rather than in a long scroll in more of a paged format. And now, thanks to improvements in web technologies, we're able to support that too. So without loading a new page, we're able to actually create this smooth scrolling text experience that responds to touch, it responds to screen size. So all of these things are possible no matter what device somebody's looking at this on. And I thought that was a pretty remarkable evolution in what we're able to support in this digital reading experience. And finally, we want it to be both shareable and portable. So we're going to talk about these two things briefly and then try and wrap things up. So shareable, we want to ensure, and now pardon the appearance, it's a little bit rough. This is still a work in progress. But as we look through this chapter, you'll notice that we have the paragraphs enumerated automatically in the left-hand margin. And as we go along, we can bookmark them and save those bookmarks for later. And we can also share them. So we can copy, and this updates as we go. So we just scrolled past paragraph number 7. And if I copy that with the share icon and go over here and paste it in, there it is. We had scrolled past paragraph 7. It just bookmarked us at paragraph 8. So we're able to take that location no matter what device we're on, no matter what size it is, no matter how much it's reflowed, communicate that location to somebody else, and they can go directly to that piece of the text no matter what device they're on when they're looking at it. So we've created a way that we can universally share a location within a text, and that's not something that has been replicated frankly, outside books like the Bible. And this is, I think, something that is a really interesting new way of thinking about sharing these things that so far, again, apart from the Bible, hasn't been embraced by any other platform. And finally, we want to ensure that we can take it with us when we are going from one device or platform or environment to another. So what I did with this project, putting up the text of Letter from Birmingham Jail online at letterfromjail.com, if you're curious, is turned it into what's called the progressive web app, so that as soon as you go to this website, you can then save that to your home screen, and it caches the whole text. In this case, it's only a couple of pages, but you could cache an entire book and save it for offline reading. And that way you can really take it with you, even though the book itself has been presented as a web page. And so I really wanted to make sure that we could close that loop and do all of the things, or at least many of the things that you can do with a digital book in other formats, and even more than what you could do in the paper format, and create not just an okay experience, but create one that has almost all of the refinements that we would bring to bear on a normal printed book, but then goes so much further with the technologies that we have at our disposal today, and make sure that we're taking this reading experience from good to great and not just good to okay. And I think that gives us a much better future to look forward to. Thanks very much.